Imagine it's 1940-something, the height of World War II, and you're all sitting in a cafe in Paris right now. And the Germans recently invaded France, and the air is filled with fear, distrust, and agony. But yet you have decided to join the resistance against the Nazis, and you're waiting for a colleague to pick up a microfilm to smuggle across the border, a deed that's possibly punishable by death. Now it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the agreed upon meeting time, and your friend isn't there yet. And you wonder, did you memorize the date and the time incorrectly, or did your friend maybe memorize them incorrectly? Or is he simply running late because the trains are running late, or has he forgotten about your meetup? But what if he has been arrested and now you're at danger of being arrested yourself? Should you wait any longer, and if so, how much longer? Or should you just make the safe choice and flee into an unoccupied territory until the end of the war? After all, could anyone even really blame you? I'm now going to tell you the story of a group of people who faced these questions every single day for 3 years. And they decided to push them aside along with the fear and continue fighting against the Nazis and their ideology. And this group of people is now known as the Dutch Paris escape line. It ended up being one of the largest, most sophisticated escape lines in World War II. And essentially what they did was transport Jews, downed pilots, and other victims from occupied parts of Europe into safety. And they operated across 6 occupied lines, 5 countries, 4 borders, and 2 mountain ranges, the Alps and the Pyrenees. And you can see here the map of what this looked like. It ranged from the Netherlands through Belgium and France, all the way to Switzerland and to Spain. And it largely was this system of safe houses along the way, of dialects that they were teaching these victims so they could blend in, of clothing, of forged passports, and so on, anything that would help them get across this significant amount of territory over many numerous days and blend in between the Nazis and the Vichy government into safety. So the beautiful thing about these people was they weren't really in danger themselves mostly, and they differed between nationalities and religions, but they were all united against the Nazi ideology and the brutality at the time. Yet all of their victims, whoever came to them, they did not discriminate. They would help anyone who needed help, whether they had the funds to cover their travel, and regardless of their religious or political or personal backgrounds. At the end of the war, it's believed that they had smuggled significant amounts of intelligence across the borders to the Allied forces, but most importantly, they saved about 3,000 victims from certain death. Now, what is the price that they paid? Of about 330 heroes, 65 were arrested, 38 deported to concentration camps, and 14 of them are believed to have died at a minimum. Now I'm going to tell you a story that stands out. It's the story of John Widener, who actually founded this escape line. And he was a Seventh-day Adventist living in France at the time, and he was visiting these refugee camps, and he was taken aback by the amount of suffering. So he started the Dutch Paris line in his textile shop in Lyon, France, that became its headquarters. And he himself, being an experienced mountaineer, was taking these refugees across all of the geographies that I just showed you. So he was very actively involved, and he was running that whole network as well. So he obviously was in grave danger. He was captured many, many times. And one of those times, he actually jumped off a train on the way to the concentration camp and saved himself. But yet he refused to stop operating this line and consider any type of safety for himself, and he fought the Nazis until the very end of the war. Now, these years weren't just perplexed by fear and danger, he also had faced a lot of moral dilemmas. In one of the most antagonizing decisions of his life, when the Nazis captured his sister, Gabrielle, and they offered to let her go in exchange for him turning himself in, he decided not to bargain with the Nazis and yet continue fighting for many more victims. And unfortunately, Gabriele Widener passed away in the Ravensbrück concentration camp on February 15, 1945. After the war, John Widener was widely celebrated. He got the Medal of Freedom from the United States government and President Truman. He got the British Military Order from King George VI, as well as the Order of Orange-Nassau by Dutch Queen Wilhelmina, and several French medals. He's also one of the righteous among the nations at Israel's Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem, and he was honored at the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1993. Now, reflecting on his wartime activities, he said, "During our lives, each of us faces a choice to think only about ourselves, to get as much as we can for ourselves, or to think about others, to serve, to be helpful to those in need. And I believe it is important to develop our hearts, to have a heart open to the suffering of others." Now, you might wonder, why are we still talking about this almost 8 decades later? After John passed, his widow Naomi started the Widener Foundation with the mission of cultivating altruism and telling this important story. And now you have to remember that most of these activities were criminal at the time and no official documentation really existed. And most of the descendants of the Dutch Paris line didn't really understand what their parents and grandparents had done during these years. So the Widener Foundation commissioned a World War II scholar, Megan Corman, to actually visit the recently declassified archives in Europe. After a decade of research, a dozen of archives across 4 languages, Megan was able to piece together the story for the first time and tell it in her book, The Escape Line. And there are many beautiful story plots to it, but I want to single out a particular one today because I think it connects the happenings of the 1940s to the present day. This story is of a woman, very young at the time, in her early 20s, that in 1944 was one of the most important members of Dutch Paris. And unfortunately, she actually got captured by the Gestapo and was repeatedly tortured, nearly drowning. Under this pressure, she gave away a list of names of the Dutch Paris members, and subsequently the Gestapo actually raided one of the safe houses and arrested most of the organization. Many of these members later perished in concentration camps. Riddled with guilt, Susie actually submerged into post-war society, and all trace was lost of her. Fast forward to many years later, a couple of years ago, we're publishing this book and we're trying to get in touch with her. And she denies being the person that we're looking for, and so do her sons. So we decide to let that go. Another year later, we hear from a man who was a young Jewish boy that was actually rescued by her during World War II, and he's asking for us to connect them so then him and his brother can thank her for saving their lives. And she finds enough strength to open her heart for this reunion to come about. So imagine, today, she is 97 years old, and for the first time, she's having closure about what happened back then, and that she did so much good before this serious, unfortunate events. On the other hand, this small Jewish boy today is 80 years old, and him and his brother have families of over 30 members. And they can finally understand what really happened to their family, and they can thank the woman that made all of that happen. So John passed in 1994, and at his funeral, Rabbi Schulweis actually reflected on the Widener experience and how it connects to the community today. And he said, "Confronting goodness may be more painfully challenging than confronting evil. It is one thing to study and condemn the sadistic behavior of a Klaus Barbie, but quite another to study and acknowledge the rescue behavior of a John Widener, because the latter presents us with a hard mirror. The rescuer's goodness shakes the foundations of my claims to virtue. The behavior of flesh and blood rescuers compels me to think long and hard about my own goodness and to imaginatively rehearse my choices in analogous situations." Okay, so now we're back in 2019, and we're sitting here in Sarajevo. Obviously, the Dutch Paris story connects closely to the city, to the atrocities of the early 90s, to the Sarajevo war tunnel of escape, to many of you in the audience, and to me as well, who was born and raised around the corner from here. And while wars differ based on causes, scale, aftermath, human emotions of fear and suffering and need are pretty universal, and so are the acts of altruism. So as we reflect today on the Dutch Widener story and on heroes, whether wartime or not, let's take a hard look at that hard mirror, and let's examine our own goodness. Think of one thing that you can do today for another person that is selfless, and go out there and do it. Because after all, what's your excuse not to? Thank you.